All right. Hello, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. We still have some people checking in. However, I think they should be able to get in just fine. Jared, we did have a couple of things on chat. If you could check those and just make sure that on the tech side, everything's okay on that, that'd be great. So hello, everyone. I'm Teresa Hanley, the project director for Toward Peace. And on behalf of the Mission Inn Foundation, I would like to welcome you to Riverside and the World, History and Memory of Peace and War. This is a speaker series in which we are hearing from historians concerning the history of Frank Miller, of Mission Inn, the Mission Inn founder, and his peace activism, particularly in the years surrounding World War I. And we're hearing both local history and the fuller national and international context. This speaker series is a featured element of Toward Peace, and we are very proud that it is made possible with support from California Humanities, a nonprofit partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. You can visit calhum.org, calhum.org, to learn more about them and the many fine programs they support throughout California. I would also like to thank our local sponsors, Judith Auth, Sally and Chuck Beatty, Kathy Wright and Dwight Tate, and Walter Parks. So before we get started, just a bit of Zoom housekeeping. We have muted audience microphones and disabled audience cameras to enhance the quality of reception for everybody. We have also disabled the chat function. You can post questions in the Q&A on your taskbar, and we will address them following the presentations. If you are having technical issues, please post those in the Q&A as well. Our executive director, Jared Hoagland, is our tech manager, and he will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the presentation. So I will be our first speaker tonight, and just to give a little background on myself, I have had several roles at the Mission Inn Foundation, beginning way back in 1983, including staff positions, a 10-year tenure as a volunteer board member. And it was during that time that I began to re-engage with some of the historical research I had done as a staff member. In 2017, I asked our longtime docent, Jerry Gordon, to join me in co-chairing a working group to explore Frank Miller's peace activism, and here we are. So I'm thrilled that Dr. Mona Siegel is joining me tonight. After my presentation on the Riverside portion of our topic, I will introduce you to Dr. Siegel, who will provide us with some of the and the world context. So I'm going to share my screen, and we'll begin to hear about Miller and women peace activists. So let's begin with this great image of women and peace. This is the American delegation to the 1915 International Congress of Women at The Hague. They are aboard the ocean liner, the Noordam, on their way to The Hague. We will hear more about the importance of this Congress from Dr. Siegel later. For now, I'd just like to point out Jane Addams, the legendary American social reformer. She is right here. So Zona Gale, in her 1936 biography, and we see the cover here of Miller, quotes him here with this great phrase. And this was supposedly in response to a hotel guest who had commented that he had thought that the Mission Inn was run by women. And here's what Miller reportedly said. So while this comment might have been kind of rueful on his part, it was also accurate in many ways, and that's what we'll be looking at a little bit tonight. On the right, we see this fabulous portrait of Miller by Hafsef Pushman, the Armenian American artist who lived in Riverside during the World War I years and had a studio, his art studio at the Mission Inn. So we do know that, that Miller was surrounded by strong women. His mother, Mary Ann, was an educated woman who had attended Oberlin College. In the years the family lived in Wisconsin, Mary Ann often homeschooled her children, including Frank, when she was unhappy with the state of the local schoolhouse. Miller was married twice, and both his wives had more formal education than he. And here we see a portrait of his sister Alice, also by Joseph Pushman. In fact, Alice managed the Mission Inn through most of her adult life, along with her husband and later with Miller's daughter and son-in-law. So those were the women at home. And tonight we will learn about some of the women in the world that Miller knew: Aletta Jacobs, Jane Addams, Zona Gale, and Fanny Fern Andrews. Before we get to some of those specific stories, though, I wanted to give us a bit of overview of peace activism at the time. Last week, when Dr. Keene spoke about Woodrow Wilson's 14-point plan, one point that caught my eye was the term arbitration, because it reminded me that by Wilson's time, many of the ideas embedded in his 14 points had already been floating among various turn of the 20th century peace movements for a few decades. So as an example, here we see an image of the Lake Mohonk Conference on International Arbitration, which was held from 1895 until 1916 at the upstate New York hotel of the Smiley Brothers. Those are the Smiley Brothers we know of Redlands. The peace activists who gathered at the Lake Mohonk Conference and at numerous other conferences and congresses of the time were beginning to establish new ideas about peace, especially that peace is more than just the absence of war, and that peoples and nations of the world could establish norms, institutions, and processes by which conflict could be resolved nonviolently. Here are a few more images. The peace activists of this time came from broad and diverse backgrounds and lines of thought. Some, like Jane Addams, were dedicated social reformers. Others were academics, diplomats, business and industrial leaders, religious leaders, and, as we will see, suffragists who played a transformational role at a critical time. All these groups met and interacted in numerous international conferences and congresses. Here we see a conference badge from the 1907 National Arbitration and Peace Congress, at which American delegates prepared their platform for the Hague Peace Conference that would follow later in that summer of 1907. The news photo next to it there is of Andrew Carnegie being honored for his peace advocacy. Another important point about the peace movements during this time is that peace thought, peace ideas were respectable and even popular. By early 1915, this sheet music had sold 700,000 copies. It was not until the US entered the war and the Espionage and Sedition Acts that peace became suspect, as Dr. Keene covered last week. Newspapers began to put the word peace in quotes, questioning its legitimacy. And with that in mind, let's take a quick look at the history of peace flags, which will be appearing throughout the stories I'll tell. So here they are. On the left this is a contemporary photo of an actual flag now displayed at the Mary Baker Eddy Library. The idea of this peace flag was first proposed in 1891 at the Third Universal Peace Conference in Rome. And the idea was that any particular nation's national flag would be bordered in white to indicate nonviolent conflict resolution. This flag was displayed in several locations before ending up with the Christian Scientists and finally at the Mary Baker Eddy Library. In the middle is an image of a flag that was apparently displayed at that 1907 Arbitration and Peace Conference. At the end of that conference, the Daughters of the American Revolution dedicated this flag to Andrew Carnegie for his peace activism. And then on the right, a picture taken in the collection storage at the Mission Inn is the mission framed in that great mission frame. This is the peace flag that Miller displayed in various events in the World War era, but which lay hidden away in storage for decades. So what do we know, or why do we think about Frank Miller and peace activism? One of the most interesting aspects of this project for me has been exploring the concepts of individual and community memory. especially what is and is not remembered, built into individual and community history, what does not and does not get told, retold, and celebrated. In Miller's case, two important elements of the built environment survived him. First of all, of course, the Peace Tower on Mount Rubidoux. This was built by people in the community to honor him. And here we see, I've transcribed from the plaque that's inset into the image, this kind of extended haiku tribute to Miller. Peace with justice, constant labor, civic beauty, community righteousness, world peace. Would that we all had those, were remembered with those comments. And of course, Miller himself conceived and built the last major addition to the Mission Inn, the International Rotunda Wing. And I'm going to try to point out for you briefly. So this section here, this U-shaped section, is the original 1904 Mission Inn Hotel. And then this along Orange Street is the addition built in 1910. Back here along 6th Street, you can't see it very well in this picture. This is the Spanish wing. This is the wing that was actually built in the era, the First World War I era. But then at the end of his life, Miller conceived and built what's essentially almost the full northwest quadrant of the whole complex there, and called it the International Rotunda Wing. This included the St. Francis Chapel with Tiffany windows for Madison Square Presbyterian Church in New York, carved seating reputedly from a Belgian convent, interior dominated by Mexican retablos, but also featuring a menorah and a tile with a symbol of the Baha'i faith. The rotunda of the name is there to the right, and then down in the right-hand corner, this very unmission style Court of the Orient, which is an indication of Miller's growing understanding of California and the Pacific Rim. At the end of his life, Miller's peace activism was also a significant factor in his obituaries in 1935 and in Zona Gale's biography, which was published in 1936. And then I think too that the Institute of International Relations, which he had helped co-found in 1926, and which met at the Mission Inn into the 1960s, meant that the memory of Miller's peace activism was kind of vaulted into a new generation of individual memories. But this remained the outline of the interpretation of Miller's peace, peace ideas told and retold for many decades. So with Toward Peace, we are utilizing some old information found through new research. In particular, information found in his daughter, Alice Miller's travel diary, and you see that there on the 4th. She kept this diary on her 1904-05 European study trip, and again in 1907 when she visited Europe with her parents. She also wrote letters to her parents, which are available in the Frank Miller Hutchins collection. And additionally, in the last 10, 12 years or so, the California Digital Newspaper Project has become very accessible, and it really is unlocking local history details in very powerful ways. And then finally, there's been a lot of new scholarship on this era. And in particular, I've used two publications, David Patterson's The Search for a Negotiated Peace, which looks at primarily at women activists, and Michael Kazin's War Against War, in which he is covering the various peace coalitions that were working to keep the United States out of World War I. So these are big contextual works that help to place our local stories in bigger contexts. So here we get to kind of the heart of my theme tonight. And that is that Frank Miller was a local leader of what Michael Kazin calls a war against war. That in the World War I era, he continued to work within his existing primarily male business and political networks, but whether or not he thought of himself as flirting with feminism, as in our title, he was clearly adopting newer public-facing, community-based type of activism favored by women peace activists at the time. So I want to just do a little quick chronology of what I mean by this. And here we see some images on the left of the Women's Silent Peace Parade in New York City, and this on the right is the newspaper from the Riverside Press newspaper article. When the war broke out in Europe, it was something of a shock for many members of the older peace groups, particularly those that had concentrated their activities in legal matters and traditional politics. As the horrors of the conflict were splashed on the front pages of newspapers across the world, a group of women, almost all suffragists, took to the streets of New York on August 29, 1914. Similar events were planned throughout the nation, and in Riverside, Miller took a leading role. He gathered local leaders, including the mayor, interdenominational clergy, other business and civic leaders, to plan a peace rally held less than a month after this silent peace parade in Fairmount Park. That was on Sunday, September 20th. So August 29th was the peace parade, Miller's rally on September 20th. The rally on the 20th featured nationally known social gospel minister Washington Gladden, who spoke on the awful crime of war. The gathered crowd, estimated at several thousand people by the daily press, adopted a series of resolutions and selected a group of people to represent Riverside at another peace parade and conference that was to be held in Los Angeles later that week. Miller was one of the representatives, and so was Stella Irvine, the Riverside woman who was a national leader of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So there we see the beginning of Miller's activism in trying to keep the United States out of the war. Early in the next year, 1915, Miller began hosting peace speakers at the Mission Inn. Often their actual talks were given across the street at the First Congregational Church. In April 3rd, for the annual Easter sunrise service, he included a ceremony for the peace flag and peace prayer. And here we see Marcella Kraft, Riverside's internationally celebrated opera singer. She had been in Europe and had returned from Germany as the war approached. And I did enhance the contrast on this image a little bit, but she is holding the peace flag. If you look closely, you can see the white border here and a little bit up here. And we have a newspaper which has the program for the day's event, indicating the ceremony for the peace flag for that day. And then the next month, on May 18th, this is just days after the attack on the Lusitania, the Riverside schools commemorated Peace Day in California schools. And this is the event around which Miller proposed placing a peace flag in every school building in California. As the war drums gathered, Miller was noticeably absent from preparedness activities. And once the US entered the war, his efforts were concentrated on home front activities, war bond drives, and food conservation. The few public statements that he made tended to revolve around support for the troops, those that were actually serving in the war. And here we have another wonderful local artifact, this locally made quilt, Our Mission Inn Heroes. And what this is, these are various Mission Inn employees who served in the war. In a February 1918 newspaper article, Miller referred to this as our service flag. And then a year later, in February of 1919, at the end of the war, Miller, his wife, and his sister hosted a dinner for mission employees who had served in the war. And then if you take a look at the detail on the left there, right here, this is this section of the larger quilt. And here we see local history reflected in some of the national stories that Dr. Keene shared last week. In the center, the gold star honors Charles Craig, a violinist who had performed at the inn. He was not killed in battle, but rather died of pneumonia at Cap Carney early after joining the service. So today we have to wonder if he might actually have been a victim of the 1918 flu. To the left of him is a young African-American man, Ormond Wilson, and he was a local youth known for his fine tenor. He had actually sung during the memorial service that Miller held in 1915 for Booker T. Washington at the Mission Inn. And then just below Mom Wilson is Julia Windsor, who was an English woman who had worked at the inn, and at some point she had returned to England, and there she served in the Women's Land Army, in which women took over farm jobs for men who had gone to war. So now we'll get to the women that Miller knew, and first of all, Aletta Jacobs, and you see here who she was. She's when I first found reference to her in 2016 in this research, I didn't know who she was. And then by the next year, she was gaining, and her profile was improving a little bit. There you see she had a Google Doodle. She was the first woman to receive a medical degree in the Netherlands. She was a medical pioneer in women's health and birth control, an international suffrage leader, and a peace advocate. And Dr. Siegel is going to tell us a lot more about Aletta Jacobs. The Millers first met Aletta Jacobs in November of 1904. She had accompanied her husband, Carol Victor Gerritsen, who was a member of the Interparliamentary Union, an early peace group. That organization had held a meeting at the St. Louis World's Fair, and then its members toured the United States. Jacobs and Gerritsen left the group in Denver and continued west, and they stayed at the Mission Inn in early November. Miller's daughter, Alice, was then in Europe on her study tour, and Jacobs and the Millers apparently determined that Alice should visit Jacobs in Amsterdam before returning to the United States. And she did. When Alice's formal school tour ended, she traveled to Amsterdam and she stayed with Jacobs for a few days in late June of 1905. And then in the summer of 1907, the family went back to Europe. This was Miller's first trip to Europe. And along with him was Isabella and daughter Alice. They went to Amsterdam where Jacobs welcomed them, a visit that would have important implications for Miller's peace activism. They visited with her for several days, and on August 14th, she took them to The Hague, then in the midst of the second of two major international peace conferences held there. The first had been in 1899, and then this one in 1907. Now, they did not go to a formal meeting of the conference. What they attended was an evening gathering of a group of international peace activists, which called itself the Cercle International. In the diary account, Alice says that Dr. Jacobs is a member of an international circle of peace activists. And that evening, they heard a talk by W.T. Steed, a famous journalist and peace activist, and Alice recorded the thrust of his talk. She says, "He talked very interestingly upon the best way to propagate among all nations the feeling of brotherhood, and thought that the thing to be done was not to deal with governments as a whole, but to have the movement come from the people, that groups of people should be sent to different countries, and these delegations should be of about 12 people, and they should include different sexes, and that they should all be united in the supreme thought of universal brotherhood." Now, it is possible that Steed's speech was the first time Miller was exposed to this idea, these kinds of ideas of citizen activism. It's very tempting to think about him in conversation with Jacobs and Gerritsen that November of 1904 when they were visiting the Mission Inn about this kind of thing, but we don't know that for sure. But it is also possible that these particular comments resonated with Alice because she was aware that her father held similar views. I think the important thing is that regardless, that summer, the Millers found themselves again, not at a formal Hague conference gathering, but among the most dynamic of citizen peace activists from around the world. And here, just quickly, here we see Steed. Here I put him in the center. He's also surrounded by women. On the right is Bertha von Suttner, who was a titanic presence in the international peace movements. And to the left is Fanny Garrison Viard. Viard was a representative of the international, was there at The Hague as an international representative of the International Council of Women, and her correspondence with May Wright Sewell, another important woman activist, provides some of the most detailed accounts of the discussions that went on in those gatherings. I wasn't going to include her because I didn't want to get confused with Fanny Fern Andrews later, but if we recall back to Dr. Keene's presentation last week and think about that John Stuart Curry painting, and when I saw the image of the grieving mother, it really reminded me of this photograph of Fanny Viard. So there she stays in this presentation. So by the time of the war in 1915, as I mentioned before, women activists gathered at the International Congress of Women at The Hague. Aletta Jacobs played a critical role in organizing the gathering, which Dr. Siegel will tell us about in a little bit. Again, I just wanted to point out that Jane Addams was there. She actually was the chair of the meeting. This is Jane Addams right here, and here is Aletta Jacobs. And as a way of kind of introducing Frank Miller's acquaintances with Jane Addams. So Jane Addams visited Riverside and the Mission Inn at least twice. In March of 1916, although it was a quiet visit, part of medical advice for rest and recuperation, she was back in 1918, this time on a more public tour to promote food conservation at the behest of Herbert Hoover. And I want to talk a little bit about Jane Addams and Zona Gale. As I've mentioned already, we in Riverside tend to think of Zona Gale primarily as Miller's biographer, but she was a very prolific novelist, short story writer, and a playwright. She was the first woman to win a Pulitzer Prize. In autumn of 1915, Zona Gale published a peace novel, Heart's Kindred, and here you see an image of it. The novel includes accounts of gatherings of women peace activists, and Gale sought Addams' opinions on the novel's drafts in August of 1915. You can see there, right kind of up in the middle of the letter, I'm going to read you just a portion of what Addams responded. I like the chapter very much, as I do all the rest of the book. I have absolutely no fault to find with the women's meeting, but something might be added perhaps. A little of the difficulty which women of the warring nations feel when they are obliged to protest. I am sending you my speech at The Hague, which I think emphasizes this. And then these two women were also both active in what Michael Kazin considers the most vociferous of organized peace groups in that pre-World War I period, the American Union Against Militarism. And down in the corner there is an image of the letterhead for that group. This group was working in direct opposition to preparedness. And in January of 16, as representatives of this, Addams and Gale were both in Washington, D.C. for major congressional hearings and intended to lobby lawmakers to keep the U.S. out of the war. So this is the letterhead. The executive committee is here, Jane Addams right here, and Zona Gale here. Now we'll turn to the last of our women of the world, Fanny Fern Andrews. I'll tell you a little bit about her organization, which was called the American School Peace League, founded in 1907. Her group was partially funded by Edwin Ginn's World Peace Foundation, which also funded the peace conference that Miller had held at the Mission Inn or hosted at the Mission Inn in 1911. In 1912, Andrews was in California recruiting local leaders for California division of the Peace School League, and she enlisted Miller in her cause. So all of this suggests the connections between Peace Day in the California schools of May 1915. And then later that summer, Andrews herself visited the Mission Inn. So what do I think? Was Miller flirting with feminism? Well, probably not. But I do want to point out that during these years, Miller was unquestionably at the height of his energy, his confidence, and his influence. As I mentioned before, that Spanish wing opened with a splashy New Year's Eve party in the Spanish Art Gallery in 1914-15. These are also the years that the Harada family was fighting against the alien land law in court, and we know of Miller's quiet support for them. Also behind the scenes during these years, he played a critical role in the negotiations with Mrs. Cornelius Rumsey over Rumsey's collection of Native American baskets. And as we also know, this would lead to the creation of what we now call the Museum of Riverside. And along with Hovsef Pushman, the Armenian American artist, and other Armenian American families in Riverside, Miller supported local Armenian relief projects. Interestingly to me, in regard to his peace activism, I would say that he is more out front, more visible. You know, we often think of that old saying about Miller that you didn't see him, but you saw his hand. But in regard to this, you definitely see him, and he's quoted in the newspapers and very much known to be in favor of peace. He worked his regional, national, and international networks, including listening to and corresponding with all of his male colleagues. However, as we have seen, important women activists were floating in and out of his orbit, and he was more than comfortable in adopting their tactics. So I'll stop sharing my screen here, and I would like to tell you a little bit about Dr. Mona Siegel, who will be placing these stories in broader national and international context. So let me tell you about her. Dr. Mona Siegel is professor of history at California State University, Sacramento. She is internationally recognized as a scholar of peace and women's history, having published books and numerous articles. Among them, Courting Woodrow Wilson, French Feminists' Appeal for a Global Suffrage Endorsement, 1917-1918, and Western Feminism and Anti-Imperialism, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom's Anti-Opium Campaign, for which she was awarded the 2011 and 12 De Benedetti Prize in Peace History. Recently, she published her second book, Peace on Our Terms, The Global Battle for Women's Rights After the First World War, about which we will hear more later this month when she is interviewed as part of our series by Dr. Kenya Davis Hayes, professor of history at California Baptist University. So if you will, please welcome Mona Siegel. There she is.
Hi, Teresa, you hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. Let me go ahead and share my screen too, and then I will go ahead and get started. So let me just start by thanking Teresa and the Mission Inn so much for inviting me to be part of this fabulous event. It's one of the great sadnesses of COVID that we weren't able to hold this in person. I've never visited the Mission Inn, and so I was really looking forward to having the excuse, but now I will just have to come as a tourist rather than as a panelist, and that I will certainly put on my agenda for our post-COVID era. Teresa asked me to kind of play the caboose to her fabulous presentation there by filling out some of the context on the women and the events that she talked about briefly. And so I suggested to her maybe I could really zero in on 3 of the women whose names she mentioned throughout her talk: Aletta Jacobs, Fanny Fern-Andrews, and Jane Addams. And so that's what I will be doing here today. These three women in particular, as Teresa said, shared a lot of interests and even acquaintances in common with Frank Miller. They, like him, played prominent roles in the national and in some cases even the international peace movement. And they shared his belief in the importance of peace advocacy, of the need to counter militaristic ideas and culture, and also to actively promote peaceful relations between nations. But these women also diverged from Miller in really important ways. Certainly the most important is that all 3 of these women were feminists. Suffragists and feminists, and believed not only in the idea of women's rights in the abstract, but they believed that empowering women politically was absolutely central to the goal of creating a more peaceful world order. And so I'll talk a little bit about how they brought those 2 things together. And then the other way that I think that they diverge some from Miller, although we can talk about this in Q&A because I'm not in any way an expert, is that Miller by 1917, by the time America entered the war, while certainly not drum pounding militarist, seems to have reconciled himself to the conflict. And his biographer, Maurice Hodgin, for example, says that he was actively involved in selling war bonds in California, and also was very interested in helping lure a military base to Riverside in 1917 to 1918, which of course had a certain economic interest to him. So we'll see how these women shared similarities, but also maybe diverged in important ways. All three of these women, while they were not, they had their own kind of independent circles that they functioned in, were all together at this International Women's Congress at The Hague in April of 1915. And I really want to stress what an extraordinary and historic event this truly was. This was the first time in any major format that anyone managed to bring members of the opposing sides of this war, which was of course ground down in this horrific trench warfare that Dr. Keene described so aptly. And in the midst of this war, suffragists managed to come together in order to denounce the war and to talk about the ways that peace could be restored. Bringing women together at The Hague in April 1915 was no simple matter. To begin with, pretty much all of the major suffrage societies of the belligerent powers were absolutely opposed to it. They denounced it. They said while their husbands and sons were off fighting, they simply could not be, found side by side with wives of the enemy. And then there's the fact that the belligerent governments were overtly hostile to it and often sought to limit women's passports and prevent them from traveling to get there. Coupled with that with the fact that that traveling in the midst of war was dangerous, submarine warfare and other aspects made this truly a dangerous undertaking. And despite all of these challenges, over 1,000 women gathered at The Hague in April of 1915. Now, many of them were Dutch and local, but there were women representing 12 different nations from Europe and North America, from neutral nations, and from both sides of the enemy lines. And the three women who had spent time at the Mission Inn prior to this conference were among the prominent members of this conference. So Dr. Aletta Jacobs, or Jacobs, as she was known in her home country, was the woman who dreamt up this conference, organized it with the help of several Dutch suffragists, and really breathed life into it in the first place. Jane Addams, upon Jacob's invitation, presided over the meetings. And then finally, Fanny Fern Andrews, who was part of the American delegation, along with Adams, who came over for the meeting, would agree to serve as one of the small numbers of core members who, after the meeting was over, would keep the ideals alive. They formed an International Committee of Women for Permanent Peace that was going to keep pushing for a peaceful solution of the conflict, and that planned to reconvene as soon as the war was over so that women's voices would be heard once again. So let me, I'll tell you a little bit more about the meeting at the end, but I want to backtrack and just give you a little bit of biographical information on these three women who Miller interacted with and who were so important to this conference. So we'll begin with Aletta Jacobs, who was born in a small town in the Netherlands in 1854. She was the oldest of the three women. She was the eighth of 11 children born to Anna and Abraham Jacobs. They were assimilated Jews, and her father, Abraham, was a country doctor. And Aletta really worshipped her father. He was a huge inspiration on her life. And she says that from a very young age, from the age of 6 on, she just knew that she wanted to be a doctor like her father. The problem, of course, was there was absolutely no path in the Netherlands or in most parts of the world for women to study medicine in the middle of the 19th century. And so her parents tried to send her away to a ladies' school so she could learn fine manners. She left after 2 weeks saying she was bored stiff and wasn't going to waste her time with that. And she really persisted in this dream that she wanted to study medicine. So she got her father's support, and ultimately what they did is they wrote a letter to the Dutch prime minister, who happened to be one of the Netherlands' most liberal politicians who had come to power in the 19th century, a man by Johan Thorbecke, that's him on the screen. And she wrote to him and said, I want to go to university to prepare to take exams to enter medical school, and I want to become a doctor. Will you give me personal permission to kind of break the law and do this? And Thorbecke agreed. He agreed that he'd let her go to university on a 1-year trial basis. And if she succeeded, and if the university didn't rise up in revolt against the idea of having a woman side by side with these men, that he would make this permanent. So Jacobs excelled, and actually one of his very final acts before he died, Thorbecke, was to write that letter saying that she could continue her studies and become a doctor. So in 1878, after passing her exams, she became the first female physician in the Netherlands. And she then turned around and set up a practice in Amsterdam. She specialized in gynecology. She had primarily female clients, or patients, I should say, from all the different social classes. She treated wives of some of the most prominent businessmen and political leaders in the Netherlands, but she also was very attuned to the social needs of her society. And so 2 mornings a week, she ran a free clinic for poor women and their children. She ran it initially in a union hall and then set up her own space to do this independently. Through this clinic, she says, and I'm quoting from her memoir here, she became haunted by the suffering caused by frequent pregnancies, which for various reasons can have a disastrous effect on a woman's life. And so through treating female patients and also prostitutes who were among her patients, Jacobs became convinced that effective contraception was one of the most necessary medical developments in order to improve the physical and mental health of women everywhere. Now, this was not something that one could talk about openly or publicly. She had to kind of do deep research to find out what kinds of contraception were even available. She ultimately decided that a relatively new form of diaphragm that had been developed in Germany showed the most promise. So she ordered a sample, and she convinced some women to kind of serve as test subjects. And once she was convinced that it was safe and effective, in 1882, she opened up the world's first birth control clinic, family planning clinic, where she prescribed birth control to women who had some form of need. Now, all of these experiences helping women in her clinic and otherwise led her fairly early on to embrace the cause of women's suffrage. She believed that women needed political rights in order to affect their economic and civil rights and every other form of life. And so the first thing she did in 1883 was she decided to test the constitutionality of women's suffrage. Just like in the United States prior to the Civil War, the Constitution didn't specifically bar women in the Netherlands from voting. And so in 1883, she tried to register to vote, and she was blocked. And so she sued in court, and it went all the way up to the Dutch Supreme Court, who kind of said, yeah, we know that the Constitution doesn't say women can't vote, but of course legislators never would have dreamt of anything else. And so effectively, no, women do not have the right to vote. So that didn't work. In fact, the court made her pay all the court fees. And then in 1893, along with some other Dutch women, they founded a Dutch Association for Women's Suffrage that Jacobs became the president of for a couple of years later. And she would remain the president for the next couple of decades until Dutch women won the right to vote in 1919. Now, working with Dutch suffragists also brought her in contact with global suffragists as well, including in the United States. She befriended an elderly Susan B. Anthony, who couldn't believe how young she was. This picture is from a little bit later, and then also Carrie Chapman Catt and Jane Addams, and we'll talk more about that connection in a moment. In terms of her peace work, her pacifism, she says, stemmed from values that she learned from her family initially, but also from her feminism. Aletta Jacobs, like many, I would say most women of her generation, really believed that there was something inherent in women's nature, in their biological capacity for motherhood, that made them more naturally peace-loving than men. And so for her, working for suffrage was a way of working for peace. And actually, that photo that Teresa showed us at Bertha von Suttner, the two of them actually went at it several times, because von Suttner believed you needed to prioritize working for peace. And Jacobs insisted, no, suffrage has to come first, because we're never going to have a peaceful world order until women are helping to shape it. She was deeply committed to peace. When World War I broke out, she was absolutely distraught. And initially, like other suffragists in all the nations of Europe, practically, she just said, we really should put suffrage work aside. We need to really focus on aiding the poor families whose lives have been torn open by this conflict. Running soup kitchens and this type of thing. But ultimately, Jacobs changed her mind. And I actually want to read again from her memoir. Her explanation here of why she decided to give up philanthropy is very interesting in the war. She said, more and more clearly, I realized that while the men who enlisted had helped make this tragedy possible, we women could have quite possibly ended the slaughter by collectively refusing to meet the needs caused by war. I wanted to call on women from every nation to protest together against the horrors of war. So she said, by taking care of poor families, doing Red Cross work, that type of thing, all that we're doing is extending a conflict. Women need to be working for peace. And so she decided to organize this International Congress of Women in April of 1915, sending out cables and letters to suffragists all over Europe and North America, inviting them to The Hague. And of the many acceptances that you see one of these telegrams sent to Jane Addams there, so of the acceptances, by far the most important came from American social worker and peace activist Jane Addams, who agreed not only to help bring an American delegation across the Atlantic, but also to chair the meeting itself. So let's take a look for a moment at Jane Addams. If you've heard of any of these three women prior to tonight, I'm guessing Jane Addams is the one. She was one of the most famous women of her day in America. So her first claim to fame was as a co-founder of Hull House in Chicago in 1889. And you're seeing the original building there, as well as a younger picture of Jane Addams. Hull House was a settlement house. So it was part of a kind of a fairly widespread progressive era movement, although this was the first model that others followed in the United States. And the idea was to provide social services for poor Americans, but not to do so as kind of distant people who swoop in and give their advice and leave, but instead to create the institutions of these social services in those neighborhoods where those offering aid would live amongst those receiving it, and they could become neighbors and friends and collaborate together. The idea really was to practice the ideals of social democracy. And so this was located on Chicago's West Side, a very highly immigrant neighborhood. European immigrants from all over, from Russia and Greece and Germany and Italy, all living side by side in this neighborhood. And so Hull House became a hub for community activities, for clubs, and for social services. Now, in terms of the residents who lived there, who helped organize all this activity, it was open to men and women both, but it particularly attracted college-educated young women who had few career opportunities. And this gave them an opportunity for a life of meaning, but where they would be surrounded by community, where they wouldn't be isolated. Um, so Hull House really launched her reputation. In 1893, Chicago hosted the World's Fair, and many of the international visitors who visited the fair came and stopped by Hull House and met her and got to know more about this project. Working in Hull House propelled Jane Addams to take up all kinds of other progressive era causes, virtually all of them, honestly. Fighting labor exploitation was one of them. She was very involved in opposing child labor and pushing for unionization, and particularly women's unionization. And then she also opposed racial violence and racial segregation in America. She was an acquaintance of Ida B. Wells, the famous anti-lynching crusader, and she spoke out against lynching herself. And then in 1909, she became one of the founding members of the NAACP. So by the outbreak of World War I, Addams was really a towering figure. The Ladies' Home Journal called her the foremost American woman. Um, when war broke out in 1914, Adams' first personal experience of it was in her own neighborhood. She saw her Russian neighbors turn against her German neighbors bitterly, and she was just distraught at the way that this war was not only killing people, was absolutely ripping open the social fabric. And so she felt paralyzed, not knowing what she could do. And then she attended in Chicago a lecture by two women who were touring the country. They were from opposing sides of this war: Emmeline Pethick Lawrence of England and Rosika Schwimmer of Hungary. And they were traveling from city to city, essentially saying to Americans, you've got to speak out and help end this craziness. And they spoke particularly to women. They said this war is the result of male statecraft. Women need to speak out and put a stop to it. And so upon their prompting, Jane Addams agreed to travel to Washington, D.C. in January of 1915 and to call a mass meeting of women in favor of peace. Over 3,000 women and a few men attended that meeting. They denounced the carnage in Europe, and then they also decided to form a women's peace party that would advocate for an end to this conflict, and also in its platform said, quote, "We demand that women be given a share in deciding between war and peace in all the high courts of debate." So this was, again, this reflection of the intersection of feminism and pacifism that was so central to these activists. Jane Addams would serve as the chairwoman of the Women's Peace Party. Shortly after the Women's Peace Party formed, Addams received that cable from Aletta Jacobs in the Netherlands asking her to come over to Europe along with a delegation of women and to please chair this meeting, this international meeting of women against the war. So less than 2 months later, after she got that cable, Addams boarded the Nordam. This is the picture that Teresa showed you at the beginning of her talk. This part of the American delegation traveled with her. There were 42 Americans total, and prepared to take up the gavel at The Hague. Now, among those American women traveling to The Hague in 1915 was the third woman who had spent time at the Mission Inn and whose life intersected some with Frank Miller, and that is Fanny Fern Andrews. Of the three, she's probably the least famous, but she actually had a very important role to play in peace activism as well in this era. Fanny Fern Andrews was born actually in Nova Scotia, but when she was a very young girl in the 1870s, her family moved to Massachusetts. They were working class. Her father was a shoemaker, but Fanny Fern Andrews managed to continue her education all the way through normal school to become a teacher. And that was really kind of the height of most careers for women in that era. Education would inform her activism for the entire rest of her life. She had interest in using education in order to foster peace. And so in 1908, she developed, or she started, this American School Peace League. You see a newspaper article describing that founding there. And what they did was they developed curriculum that could be used in American schools in order to instill a respect for peace and an understanding of the institutions of peace among school children. And so this curriculum was for kind of all up and down the ages of children. She wrote songs that could be sung among the younger ages. She wrote up kind of like texts that could be used to sponsor oratorical competitions among secondary students. And she wrote the vast majority of this curriculum. Eventually, the League expanded to, I think, 40 different states in the United States. But she was the central organizer and the real kind of brainchild behind the curriculum itself. It made her quite well known among Department of Education officials in DC. And then finally, she also believed that ultimately this reform of education couldn't happen just at the national level. It needed to happen at the international level as well. And she called for the creation of an international education bureau that could foster this kind of curriculum all across and among the nations. Well, when World War I broke out, this went against everything that she had been working for. She went to DC in 1915 and attended that peace rally and helped found the Women's Peace Party with Jane Addams. And in April of 1915, she too went to The Hague in order to attend the International Women's Congress. When it opened on April 28th, 1918, the Americans, including Jane Addams, only just barely made it. They had crossed the ocean, they'd made it to the English Channel, but the English had closed down all shipping in the channel for weeks. And the American women despaired as to whether they would even be able to cross. So they made it there literally within hours of the beginning of this conference. And when that happened, there was all kinds of apprehension. Nobody knew what was going to happen when members of the opposing nations found themselves face to face. In the first day of the meeting hall, there were Dutch policemen stationed absolutely everywhere in case the women started brawling. And Adam said that she too was pretty nervous. But what they eventually did that was very smart is they agreed that nowhere in this conference were they going to talk about the causes of the war or responsibility for the war. And instead, they were going to focus on what women could do to bring about its end. So the women were together for 3 days and they passed a whole series of resolutions, about 20 of them, of what they wanted to see happen going forward. They demanded women's enfranchisement, women's political power as part of the peace terms. They believed that women's political participation was necessary, again, for the establishment of lasting peace. They called on women to reconvene at the time of the eventual peace conference so that their voices would be heard and that they could have an influence on those eventual peace terms. They called on neutral nations to offer continuous mediation until and when the point in time when the warring parties would come to the table. And then finally, they wanted the warring parties to make known what their peace terms were. On what basis would they begin to talk about laying down their arms? Now, rather than just kind of issuing these proclamations and going home, the women decided to send delegations out to each of the belligerent states and to many of the neutral powers as well, in order to convince them of the importance of this. And so Jane Addams and Aletta Jacobs, along with a Italian delegate, were put in charge of visiting all of the warring nations, except for Russia. A different delegation went there. They met with foreign ministers, they met with prime ministers and presidents. They met with Woodrow Wilson, or Adams met with Woodrow Wilson when she returned home. And all of them received these women respectfully, but their proposals were ignored. And so leading mainstream journalists tended to kind of either ignore them or minimize their efforts or even to mock them. And the response in America, while there, as Teresa said, peace had been a fairly popular cause in 1914 and still in 1915. But even already by the end of 1915, the culture around this war was starting to shift. And Adams figured this out the hard way when she returned home. One of the very first things she did was to go to Carnegie Hall and to speak at a big peace rally there. And one of the things she talked about when she was there was that she met with soldiers over in Europe, and they told her about the fact that often they were given alcohol to help steel their nerves before they went into battle. She was trying to humanize these soldiers. Well, this was just too much for some critics, and in particular, Richard Harding Davis, who was a war correspondent for an American war correspondent, but also a rabid anti-suffragist, posted a letter in the New York Times where he more or less said, Ms. Adams knows nothing of what she's talking about. She's saying that these, soldiers are all a bunch of drunkards. You can see part of that letter here. They were, killed in a drunken brawl as opposed to for real ideals. And at the bottom there, he described her as a complacent and self-satisfied woman. Well, he was kind of a lone voice in 1915, but by 1916 and certainly by 1917, peace was no longer a popular cause. So that others who had really celebrated Adams before, like Teddy Roosevelt, for example, who had once asked her if she would help nominate him for president, he kind of denounced that relationship, calling her and the other women peace prattlers and telling them they should not be involved where women should just not be involved. So the minimizing or mocking of these women means that their efforts were kind of dismissed, and then over the years were largely forgotten, were written out of the history books, and largely forgotten in both history and in popular memory. Really only a small number of pacifists remembering what this effort had been all about. To end on a slightly more upbeat note, it's interesting that just in the last 10 years and even the last 5 years, both historians and international relations scholars have really rediscovered these women and come to see them as a model, as the United Nations and other international organizations come to recognize the importance of including women in peace and security measures. And this is an article that was published just in 2018 by two very prominent international relations scholars. And you can see I underlined there, they use this article to show that how the principles articulated by the pacifists at The Hague represent a distinct contribution to international relations. And they argue we still have a lot to learn from them. And then the very last point I'll make is that all three of these women, Jacobs, Adams, and Andrews, did I'm going to use a military term because I can't think of another one, but remobilize, reinvigorate their efforts when World War I came to an end. They all were parts of several different major meetings held by women at the end of World War I, at the time of the Paris Peace Conference, along with women from all over the world. Egypt and China and Korea and elsewhere, who were demanding a role for women in laying out this new world order. And so that is really what my book is about, not the World War I period itself, but the period immediately following the war and the upsurge of global feminism and global women's activism kicked off in that moment. So I do hope that all of you will be back on March 31st when I am able to talk about this in more detail. So thank you so much for bearing with me.
All right, thank you. That was fabulous. and exactly what we were hoping for in terms of trying to put our local history in that national and international context. So now we know a lot more about Riverside and the world. So for our audience members, if you would like to ask a question, we have a few questions and I'll get to those in a minute. But be sure to type those into the Q&A section. On your taskbar, you'll see Q&A. And when you click on that, that will bring up a screen and you can type in your question. We did have a couple of people who raised their hand, and we don't really have a way to handle that. So if you have a question, be sure, if you raised your hand because you have a question, be sure to put that into the Q&A. So the first two questions I think are really Riverside questions. So I'll address those as I can, which is not really great. The first one was, can you elaborate on Miller's quiet support for the Haradas? And I'm going to take the easy way out and suggest that you take a look at Mark Rowich's book, The House on Lemon Street. He has an entire chapter called In the Shadow of the Mission Inn, which is a really fabulous account of what I would call sort of Miller's multiculturalism and the sources for that, and also the kind of behind the scenes support that he provided to the Haradas. And then I'll just say from personal experience, because I knew Sumi Harada, she was a longtime member of the Friends of the Mission Inn, and the family absolutely recalled his support for them during that trying time. So that's Mark Rowich's book, The House on Lemon Street. And then another question was, what were Miller's interactions with Eliza Tibbets like? And I'm not sure that they knew each other that well. Eliza Tibbets, Mona, is the woman that we trace the origin, or well, the growth of the navel orange industry in Southern California. She was a suffragist and progressive for her time, but she died in 1898. I just Googled her to find that out. And so I don't know, another local historian might know something. And if you're on the call and you do, please type something into Q&A and I can read it out for everyone. So Mona, I don't know if you can address this, but and if not, I can say a few things. But Dwight Tate asks, where did the energy or motion come from for the peace movement in the first part of the 20th century?
So I can answer that kind of generally and then a little bit more specifically. I mean, there was a lot of, whether there's the constant threat of warfare, much of it stemming from imperialism and clashes over territory in Africa and elsewhere, that was bringing either actually bringing European powers to blows or almost bringing them to blows. And then also the dissolution, or the beginning of the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, which also was kind of wreaking havoc in the Balkans, which also was bringing war kind of right to the borders of Europe. And partially in response to this kind of drum beating and also kind of naval buildup and military buildup, some of the European leaders began to push for some form of international conventions or international collaboration that could, put a halt or at least a limit to the use of arms. And so there were these two big conferences held at The Hague. This is not the Women's Hague Conference that I'm talking about, but the first was held in 1899, and Aletta Jacobs was present at that one. And then the second in 1907 is the one that Teresa alluded to. And both of these brought together not so much world leaders, but specialists from countries all over Europe and all over the world, who talked about everything from arms control to other types of conventions. And those Hague conferences were really widely followed in the press. They explain some of the optimism of people like Fanny Fern Andrews, who really wanted to build on that kind of collaboration and spirit and spread it to the next generation.
Good. We have a comment from Karen Rains, who Mona, I think you know, is one of your former students, and she's also a former staff member at the Mission Inn Foundation. In fact, she is how we found Mona. So Karen just has a comment thanking us, and I'll just say right back at you there, Karen, because we've really enjoyed working with Mona. So thank you very much for being here tonight and for introducing us to Mona. So that's all the questions that we have. We have some other comments, and thanking everybody. And again, thank you all for being with us. We'll just, I don't know, Mona, did you have anything you wanted to say to wrap up, just in case somebody comes up with a burning question?
No, I mean, just to say that one of the really wonderful things about this conference is, really taking the opportunity to explore the melding of the local, not just the local and the national, but the local and the international. And so I think that we've really done that here tonight. And I know we're going to do more of that in the weeks ahead. And I think it's just kind of a unique type of event. And we're all lucky to get to participate in that.
Thank you. So actually, someone has made, well, actually we have two. Let me do the question part first, and then I'll come back to the comment, which is a really great comment. So our local president of the League of Women Voters, Joan Donahue, is asking, the League of Women Voters were huge supporters of Wilson's League of Nations. Can you speak to peace activist support for the organization?
Sure. So the League of Women Voters, and I'm sure the person who asked this question knows this very well, was the successor organization to the NASA, the National Women's Suffrage Association in America. That was headed by Carrie Chapman Catt. And so once women, even actually slightly before they got the vote in 1920, they began switching over to preparing women to be active citizens, as opposed to just soliciting the vote. Carrie Chapman Catt had also been a pacifist prior to World War I, but she traveled a different path than Jane Addams did. Carrie Chapman Catt ultimately decided that what was most important to her was suffrage, and she believed that the clearest path to establishing that in the United States was by supporting Wilson and supporting the war effort, showing that women could be good patriots, and that would help them win the vote. And so when it came to World War I, Wilson far preferred Carrie Chapman Catt and the moderate suffragists to Alice Paul and the women who were, standing sentry outside of the gates of the White House and really embarrassing him. And so this tight relationship between Wilson and Carrie Chapman Catt deepened once he switched to support for women's suffrage. And then many of these moderate suffragists then shared a general commitment to peace activism. And that became part of the program of the League of Women Voters as well.
Very good. And then Marilyn Sequoia has sent me a note because I didn't mention something that's very, very important. In Riverside, we have a local version of the Fellowship of Reconciliation called Inland Communities Fellowship of Reconciliation. And Marilyn asked me to let everyone know that this is an organization founded at The Hague in 1914 as a European ecumenical Christian organization, now an interfaith organization. And Riverside has had this chapter since 2002. And that Jane Addams is one of the original founders of the International Fellowship of Reconciliation. And our local chapter is one of our community partners on Toward Peace. So thank you, Marilyn, for pointing out my failure to mention that. And thanks for being here and for everything that Fellowship of Reconciliation is doing with us and in the community. So I think that with that is a good place for us to end. So I wanted to thank everyone again for being here. Next week, we will hear from Emily McEwen, who is an independent historic resource consultant, but also a former staff member of the Mission Inn Foundation, who has did her dissertation on the Mission Inn and its collections. And she'll be speaking to us about internationalism, imperialism, and collecting tragedy at the Mission Inn. So that should be very good. So thank you all, and thank you, Dr. Siegel and Jared, for being our tech manager, and we'll see you all next week. Bye-bye. Thank you.